Hi, Loretta Lepore. It's so good to have you on the Comms Futurist podcast. Thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, me too. We met a couple of months ago, I believe. We did a kind of a networking virtual coffee and just hearing about your career and particularly some of the crisis comms and high stakes situations that you've been in. I was just really, really interested to kind of dive deeper into some of that and to hear more about how you navigated it and what that work looked like. So, would love for you to tell us just a little bit about your career. We'll start with that and kind of at a high level, some of the communications work you've done and what the range has looked like.
So I generally say that my career has spanned three pillars. The first part of my career was working as a broadcast journalist in both radio and TV, and I worked in the DC market, and ultimately CNN relocated me to Atlanta, where I spent pretty much the bulk of my career post-media. And then the second part of my career has been in government service, working both at the state level for a governor as well as at the federal level for the CDC. And then, and in consulting, and I've done consulting work both as part of a large law firm within a government affairs practice, as well as in my own consulting business, which I'm currently working through today.
Yeah, that's great. And specifically, I know you were at the CDC during COVID, right? And you have really been through some pretty high stress situations in some of these roles. So could you talk a little bit about that as well, just at a high
Sure.
level?
Sure. So obviously, COVID was an unprecedented event of magnificent scale. And, within the CDC structure, there is a protocol that occurs when there is a public health outbreak, disease outbreak. And there is an emergency response. There is a joint information center, which operates within the response. And the whole reporting structure then changes in that the head of the emergency response reports directly into the director of the agency. My role was at the time senior advisor to the director, overseeing all of his communications, both internally and externally. So a myriad of stakeholders, as you might imagine, in the public health arena. And so we were not only navigating a disease outbreak, which CDC is quite accustomed to. I had been there during an outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I had experience with how the operations center worked and working with the JIC, the communicators within. And also we had a vaping outbreak. If you recall, it was at the time called the E-Valley outbreak, and that happened on the chronic disease side, which is somewhat rare, but necessitated the standing up of a similar operations center. So I had my feet in the mix and understanding how it was going to work, in an emergency type situation. However, COVID presented a little differently, and we didn't have as much time, and so it grew somewhat organically within the organization, within one of our centers, before moving into a full-blown emergency operations center. And then COVID just presented a whole myriad of issues in terms of remote work and having to communicate virtually with virtually everyone. And that included my communications with the director of the agency. But what I learned in that situation is it became ultimately a national emergency, which took on a whole nother layer of complexity. And so you had agencies across the federal government that were now part of this response, initiative, and the White House running and overseeing what was the day to day. So there was, while you have the best plans in place for crisis communication situations, for disease outbreaks, no matter whatever the situation may be, a natural disaster, oftentimes you have to learn to be adaptable in a situation. And then that means really quick thinking and being prepared with your skill set. So it wasn't my first rodeo in terms of crisis communications. I had worked in those settings, both on the client, with clients, as well as in other government settings, and with businesses that faced crisis issues. And so, of a range, and really pulling together all of that experience helped me navigate through the day in, day out of COVID at the CDC.
Mhm. And it, kind of jumping into that, I am curious about how you coped with the day to day of that. I remember you talking about being really intentional about getting outside and really kind of making sure you were baking some of that into your day. But could you dive a little bit deeper into how you coped with some of that stress specifically at CDC?
hmm I would say that the COVID outbreak at CDC was not conducive to to
Yeah.
breaks. It was nonstop, 24/7, and it went on for months at a time. And my colleagues at the agency at the time were enduring the same level of pressure, stamina, and so that's why it's so critically important to have a regimen a regular regimen before going into a crisis situation. So you're building that into your everyday sort of planning. If you're a walker, if you're a runner, if you're, I can't tell you how many calls I took with our CFO while she was running and I was walking. And, so it was finding ways to get away from the computer, get out in fresh air, see some sunshine, but still being available all the time. Um, but I would say that generally, in preparation for things like that, it's like being an endurance athlete. You have to
Mm,
think the same way because it's not a sprint, it's a long-term engagement. And so you have to worry about your sleep. You have to make sure your diet is appropriate for you, and for you to maintain a sort of a healthy standard, whatever that means for you individually. And then exercise helps relieve however you want to relieve that pressure. At the beginning, the middle, or the end of the day, as I said, and that can be in a whole myriad of ways for different people. For me, it's walking and being outside. And so there were times at CDC and in all my jobs, quite frankly, when I was working at the state capitol, it could get seriously intense during the legislative session. And there were times where, emotions would get really high, and for me, the way to break was I would just do circles around the Capitol. I'd just go outside and I'd walk around the Capitol. I did CDC had some paths that I would walk around, and sometimes with my colleagues, and that's how we would just have meetings. And so it's really trying to make sure that you as an individual are prepping yourself for those high intensity events before they occur.
mhm. Yeah. I'm curious how your approach to crisis comms has changed, if at all, as you've experienced these different high pressure points, right? I mean, I know certainly COVID, being at the CDC, we talked about that. You were at the Port Authority during the supply chain crunch. And in other situations, has your approach to crisis comms changed? Have your perspective changed? Have you, as you've moved through those inflection points in your career?
I think I haven't changed as much as I've refined my
Mm,
thinking, um,
mhm,
and been able to ensure that there were certain mechanisms in place for the eventuality that there could or would be a crisis of some sort. And I think in the world we live in today, given whatever it may be, the regulatory environment, which is under constant change, whether it's tariffs and how that's impacting businesses, whether it's the geopolitical conflicts that are around the globe, they're all impacting organizations. And it doesn't matter what type of organization. It could be a nonprofit, it could be government, it could be a private, industry. But everybody's affected. And that means that the role of the communicator, in my view, and I see this becoming more of an awareness more generally in the C suite, that communications is a vital component to managing through change. One, and that's change when there isn't crisis or high intensity. and then it's managing through crisis. And the role of the communicator in the situation is revealing blind spots.
Mm.
Our role by and large is visioning. So, seeing ahead, we should be looking at what's ahead, following the trends, seeing what's happening down the road, and then preparing our leaders for that eventuality, but how to communicate what's going to be the business impact of whatever's coming down the road. And that's what makes communicators valuable in today's environment. It's not what we're producing. What we're producing is a byproduct of our expertise, but it is our visioning. It is because communicators are working with the media all day long. And if you're working with the media all day long, you know what's top of mind to them. You
Yep.
know where they're going. And, you should be monitoring everything. And so that's the value of the communicator in general and how that's changing today. And then I think in crisis, what I've learned is before a crisis strikes, understanding who your internal decision makers are going to be and making sure you have, like, I always set up a sort of central command, right? A lot of organizations today, private industry, as well as government, have the apparatus that I've suggested, an emergency operations center, a JIC, whatever the case may be, or some
Mhm.
model of that. But where that doesn't exist, I set that up so that you get quick approvals on things that you need because you have to inform your internal stakeholders, your employees, just as quickly as you're having to inform your external stakeholders. And the pace at which information flows these days, you've got to be on it. And so those folks need a heads up to know. And in several cases, I did have to activate that and say, hey, I need, we're going into this situation, whether it's a hurricane, whatever, we're activating this, be prepared, watch your email, and respond at any time of day that I
Yeah.
need you to respond because for your division, for your unit, you're the sign off. And we're going to need that sign off in quick order. So that's one refinement that I tend to bring to the table. I think the other thing that is critical in crisis comms is, um, and probably the most critical thing, is collecting as much information as possible about the situation as as soon as possible so that all that information can be pushed out as soon as possible, right? You
Mhm.
don't want lingering questions. You don't want information, coming out, straggling out. You want to put out as much as you can because you want to mitigate the situation and you want, clearly to be transparent in a situation, even if you are the party that has bad news to share.
Yeah.
So you want to be transparent in sharing it. So those are just a few of the things that I've kind of learned over time.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's that's great, thank you. Excuse the barking dog
No,
there.
thank you.
Um, so I'm curious, since you've been on the journalism side and the communication side, right? Is there anything that you wished as a journalist when you were in that role that more communicators understood about being on that side of things?
I think as a journalist, and journalism has changed so much over time, and the environment has gotten so much noisier, and there's just the cacophony of information is overwhelming. But as a journalist, you have a lot of incoming, right? You've got a lot. So what you want communicators to know as a journalist is don't send me an email that is got, a laundry list of things. Be very succinct. Tell me what, the point is. What is the value of the information you're imparting? What is the timeliness, most important? What is the relevance of that information so that the reporter can make a decision quite quickly? If they get bogged down in a lot of things and a lot of information and they have to sort through it, they're less inclined to do it because they don't have time today, as they've got so many responsibilities and they're stretched thin that you have to be succinct.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point. I see journalists talking on LinkedIn all the time saying, please don't send me one email and then oops, replied, follow up, follow up, follow up. Just get it all in one email and send it to me like that and make it skimmable and all of these things. And it just makes it easier so that communicators can get some of the coverage that they're looking for, right? And kind of building that relationship with reporters so that a journalist knows, oh, this comms person really has it together. They're always quite organized. They're responsive. I think those things go a long way.
Right, and knowing how they cover stories, right? You need to as a
Hmm.
communicator, so on the other side as a communicator, you need to know the journalists that are covering you. Oftentimes, and in some of the situations I've been in, the journalists have been covering the organizations longer than I had been there and had tremendous institutional knowledge, right? So their information, their knowledge base is on par with some of our subject matter experts. Right. And they may have even been covering the agency or the business longer than the subject matter expert's been there.
Right?
So you have to respect that. And a big part of both getting your stories covered and for journalists getting the information you need is building that relationship before you need it and establishing a relationship primarily with those that are covering you on a regular basis. When you get into a crisis situation, like for example, with COVID at the CDC, we had reporters that covered the CDC on a regular basis on the national press. But when you get into something at that scale, you then have a myriad of more reporters that aren't familiar with the agency, aren't familiar with public health, aren't familiar with the underlying circumstances of decisions you're making or why you're making them or systemic issues within the organization. And so you have to be patient. And as a communicator, part of your role becomes education. You have to bring that reporter along. You have to help that reporter ascertain the information they're seeking from you, but you also have to provide them the context so they understand the context of the information they're relaying. And they may not know that even when they're asking you the question. So,
Hmm.
oftentimes I would get a question about, well, why did you do this? Or why is this like this? And I'd have to explain. A big part, for example, was how data was relayed from public health departments across the country into the CDC, and then how that information and data was collected and synthesized and then pushed back out. And so, how did our data reporting during COVID work? And really it revealed that there was a breakdown in technology systems that predated, the COVID outbreak. And so, that was a systemic issue that a new reporter or even a veteran reporter might not understand because it wasn't important before. You had time, you
Yep.
didn't have to explain it, but now you do.
Totally. That's a great point about the communicator's relationship with the journalist and what that looks like. Could you talk a little bit about the experience at the Port Authority? I mean, that was a big news story as well, in addition to the CDC. And I'm curious what that situation looked like from specifically the supply chain issues. I'm curious what that situation looked like from a crisis comms perspective in its own right.
So I would say that, the supply chain crisis was like dominoes from COVID, right? So that was the next domino.
Yep.
And, you saw that was really an outcome of policy. So, there was money that was going out to folks. Folks were working, living from home, not going out, ordering products online. So there was a tremendous upsurge in e-commerce, which meant that there was then a tremendous upsurge in supply and shipment of products that needed to get from, ports around the world, to US consumers and vice versa. And there just wasn't preparation for something of that scale, right?
Hmm.
So, there was a whole series of things that would be impacted. So you had a tremendous amount of cargo coming into US ports. Sometimes you couldn't get that cargo off of the terminal quickly enough because there wasn't anywhere to take it. the warehouse where that shipment might be going might be stacked up with other containers that needed to be offloaded and couldn't be offloaded because the warehouse was full. And then, they had to get the shipments from the warehouse either to people's front doors or to store shelves. And it was more, in this case, more to front doors because it was the surge of e-commerce. And so there was just a whole lot of change and unanticipated volume. I would say nowadays, if that were to happen now, it would be a different story because ports across the country have built in some elasticity to their operations. They've built in capacity to ebb and flow based on the need. And retailers and the shipping industry have changed their thinking. So I had the privilege to attend what's called the RELA conference, which is the primary conference for retailers in the supply chain and their supply chain folks. And
Mm.
it was really interesting to hear from them at that time about how they were beginning to build into all of their planning flexibility. And the role of supply chain, much like communicators today, the role of supply chain was moving up to the C-suite where it was becoming more emphasis, which, you could weigh either way, like,
Sure.
it's in any vertical, do you really want that much exposure? Do you not want? So
Yeah.
anyway, but it became much more important within the business ecosystem. But flexibility was the name of the game. So everybody, as an outcome, I think, of that supply chain, everybody that's in the supply chain has figured out ways to build in resiliency, and
Mm.
in addition to capacity. And so the challenge there was, as ships were stacked up at ports waiting to get in, you had to be very clear and concise and consistent in providing real-time information to all of your stakeholders because they needed to know and wanted to know where their shipments were at all times.
Yeah.
And so it was really, again, working with journalists to make sure they had accurate information, timely information, that you were conveying the accurate situation at your facility. And so, it was not a 9 to 5.
Right. And it sounds like none of these roles that you've described so far were. And, you know, there really is this huge demand on professionals across functions when something like this happens, and it really is an all hands on deck, so to speak, situation. And so I am curious how you advise communicators specifically to prepare their teams for the fact that these crises rarely happen in this nice and neat 9 to 5 window, right? We talked a little bit about how to prepare yourself and make sure you have measures in place, but what about for leaders kind of advising their team? What do you recommend?
Mhm. Well, I think, communications today, anybody entering the field really needs to understand that by its nature, it's not a 9 to 5 role.
Yeah.
And if you are looking for that, then you need to really be purposeful in speaking with people about the role, because news happens whenever it happens,
Yeah.
and you can try to control that, but it doesn't always work out that way. So with teams, what I try to do is um, provide relief in the downtimes, right? So it's the preparation, it's being prepared, it's building out whatever might be evergreen that you can do, dealing with and preparing, right? Because when crisis hits or a high intensity moment hits, all those day-to-day things kind of get pushed down and they can't always be ignored. They have to keep going. And so as a leader, you've got to balance that. You've got to balance what still needs to be happening from a communication standpoint with what is happening in a crisis situation. And so I think you have to be very clear and purposeful. And if and when this occurs, this is how the scheduling's going to look. This is what I'm going to need you to do. it's setting the expectation. This is where you're going to need to be. And it might be different for different protocols. For example, if it's a national emergency, like a national disaster, it might be a different situation because it depends on where you need to be and who needs to be there. Versus if it's a data breach, that's a whole different scenario. And that might
Sure.
fall upon other people on your team. And so it's making sure you're balancing your team, but in the downtimes, allowing uh, uh, breath. So, in that I mean, if there's an opportunity to say, hey, it's slow this afternoon, head out. Or, if you want to do this at this time and then work later, fine.
Mm.
And part of that is from my just experience of being an entrepreneur as well. You're never really off the clock when you're an entrepreneur. So, but you do have the liberty as an entrepreneur to drive your schedule, in some respects. And so it's the ability to find those times where if there's uh, a baseball game that one of your employees wants to attend or your team members, allow breath for that to happen, because when it gets intense, you're losing time with family. And you
Mhm.
have to always remember, and we did a lot during COVID, remember and acknowledge the families of the public health professionals that were deployed or working around the clock, because it was a family commitment. It wasn't just that individual's commitment to the organization, it was the entire family making that commitment. And so that's really important to acknowledge.
Absolutely. It is, yeah, it is a commitment from the whole family, and there are sacrifices that have to be made and choices. And, um, I hear this idea a lot around how when it comes to personal life and professional life, the idea in any situation that we can give 100% of ourselves to all of these aspects of our life is really quite unrealistic. You put that in the situations that you're talking about, right? Where they're extremely high pressure, high stress, 24-hour cycles. I think that's even more pronounced, right? This idea that you really can't put 100% of yourself into all of these different aspects of life. There are going to be some things that have to give.
hmm Yeah, and the clearer the expectation is coming into it, both both you as the leader setting the expectation for what the role entails, but also the employee or the prospect explaining to you what they're not necessarily what their needs are, but what they see in the role, so that there's a clear understanding both ways that if you accept this role, this is going to be what it looks like.
Mhm.
And, them saying, yeah, that works for me, or no, that doesn't. I place a higher premium here than there. And that's knowing your values, right? That's knowing your personal values. And that's all part of who you are. And that's all part of your personal brand. And that's instrumental in having, particularly if you're a communicator. So you need to know what those values are first. And second of all, what your boundaries are for protecting those values.
Mhm. Absolutely. I remember we talked about this when we first met, and it's something I say a lot is you have to know what value you bring as a communications professional and what you value, right? And knowing the answers to both of those questions, I think, can get people a long way. I think especially now in, the age of AI and misinformation, disinformation, all kinds of things, knowing, to your point, kind of what your moral compass is and what you value is so important. So could you speak a little bit more on that, how you bring that into your communications work, and if you've had to confront that kind of in real time, what that's looked like?
Yes. So, I'm often asked what advice I give to people starting out in the profession. And one of the things that I say, whether you're taking a media path or you're going to be in political communications or policy communications or even in corporate communications, you really need to understand your own moral compass. And that means your own sensibility of right and wrong, what your boundaries are to protect that, what your personal code of ethics is. Right now, every company, every organization has a set of values, and ideally, you're going to accept a role in an organization where your values and the organizational values align. And
Mhm.
the more aligned they are, and the more that there's a cultural fit, the less inclined you are to have to monitor your boundaries, right? It should be not something that you're having to work through on a daily basis. That's not to say that you still shouldn't know them. You should. And you will be pushed. And there are some arenas where, particularly when you're in high intensity environment, as I mentioned, like during a legislative session, during a natural emergency, during, a disease outbreak, people get pushed. People get tired. People emotions rise as there are big decisions being made. And you have to make sure that you are moving and deciding within your own framework, no matter what is being asked of you. And so I think probably the most challenging for me was during my time at the CDC and during COVID, because there was so much being asked of us. And when you're in an environment like that, so um, my role while I served at the pleasure of the president and the director of the agency, um, my oath was to the Constitution and the people of America.
Mhm.
And then add to that mix my own personal standards and values and ethics. And what I was modeling at the time for my children, who were working in the same home that I was working in, that was really critically important to me that they saw me making decisions and choices that were for the right reasons, benefiting the most people and being true to my core values and true to the American public. And there are laws and there are regulations and there are rules, and yet people might ask you to bend them. And there might be policy decisions being made that work against, what your personal ethics or may be. And there were times that that occurred. And most of the time I was able to express why I thought that wasn't the best way to move forward, and oftentimes my counsel was received and accepted. When it wasn't is when I knew I had to leave.
Mm.
And so that's a decision that you often also have to make. It's not about saying no, but it is about being able to wake up the next day and look yourself in the mirror and say, okay, today I don't have a job, but I have my whole personhood intact, And
Your integrity.
that's
Yeah.
important. That's really important. And as I said, you're modeling for others. You're modeling for junior staffers. You're modeling for, your colleagues. You're modeling for your children, for your spouse. You want to be congruent and with who you are, and that includes, how you're spending your day 9 to 5 and beyond.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that is really important. And I think, even seeing top officials at CDC or NIH or, whatever health organization it was, kind of having disputes with the Oval Office, I think that was really out and open for the public to kind of watch. And I really respect what you said about, your kids were living in the house, and, you had to answer to them as well as kind of the American public at large. And I just think that's it's such a good example of really having to follow your moral compass. And I really admire that about you. I'm also curious. I know the CDC was under intense scrutiny around how it communicated, right? And so I mean, you strike me, Loretta, as an extremely talented professional communicator who, I mean, really, I think, are top notch at what you do. And I'm curious how that felt because there's only so much you can control, right? And you had a very specific element of comms at the CDC. But I'm curious what that did to kind of your frame of mind or your headspace as you were trying to just go about your day to day work, right?
Right. I think, initially at the outset, um, you know, when you're a career communicator, a professional communicator, and you have learned what we'll call the best practices of crisis communications, and you've seen them work, right? They work. And when you start to see things not working, it's concerning. It's disheartening. But at the same time, you can't belabor it. You have to adapt to what circumstances are at play because there is a greater mission at hand. I think, and when you're in it, sometimes you lose the visibility. It's the forest for the trees. And if you're
Mhm.
in the trees and you're in the trees, like, at the roots, you're not seeing the forest. And so that too is sometimes why I would step outside of my environment, right? Because you had to pull back. You had to give yourself some breathing space to say, okay, wait a minute, before I make that decision, let's see I got to pull back and see the bigger decision. What are the implications of this decision going to be? Um, and so that was difficult, at first. But we were in uncharted water, right? So once it became a national emergency and the operational center really moved up to FEMA, we were now one of many agencies that were participatory in that. Now, granted, we and the other HHS agencies had the expertise, the medical, professional, scientific um, expertise. And for me personally, um, I held my colleagues at the CDC in the highest regard. These were professionals that they knew their work well. They had committed, they were dedicated. I watched them dispatch out to public health centers across the country to help where the need was greatest, where public health departments were understaffed but had huge populations to address. And there was never a question. They just got up and went. And so I valued that. And so I think sometimes what bothered me was when there were kind of, accusations against the CDC that were unfounded or, and it was hard to counteract that as a communicator. I also, I've worked in politics and I was in politics a long time. And I'm a big firm believer that leaks never help any organization. And they just kind of create a certain level of toxicity that becomes even harder to overcome for communicators. And so I felt like, you know, seeing the reputational issues get chipped away at, it was disheartening, but at the same time, it was like, again, there's a long game here. The mission is to ensure the safety of the American public and others around the world where we could be helpful or had influence or had teams on the ground to contain this outbreak. And so I was very conflicted
Mm.
in that model.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I am curious if you could talk about your career in politics a little bit, because I imagine that that experience helped inform some of the work you went on to do, because there was so much kind of political tension baked into the COVID pandemic and how it was being handled in the US. Could you talk about your career in politics a little bit?
Sure. So, I've worked for and with candidates as a consultant and as a surrogate, and actually run for office myself. And so, political communications is a whole lot different.
Yeah.
And you have to have an appetite for it. You somewhat have to have a certain DNA component to be part of it. But for me, at the end of the day, it was all about doing better. And, when I served in state government, it was having the ability to affect outcomes, to be able to watch how communicating in a way that could affect outcomes that could truly change lives was such an amazing feeling,
Mm.
if you were able to make that happen. And one of the pieces of legislation that I kind of always looked to on that was early in my tenure in the governor's office. There was legislation the governor took up. It had been pending in the legislature and bouncing around for years and years, was this Child Protection Act. And Georgia was actually the last state in the nation to put that into place. And
Wow.
he vowed to get that passed, and he also took it up a couple levels by adding new components to it that were more in keeping with what was happening in the environment today. And and I went toe to toe every day with the head of the committee who was pushing back, and he was pushing back for reasons that really had nothing to do with the legislation itself, but more
Sure.
with other issues around, his position and this and that. And so in the political arena, you're not just, while you may have altruistic motives, you also have personal agendas. You also have, people that make decisions, maybe unlike business, where decisions are around the bottom line, right? It's around revenue generation. It's about preventing impacts to business. It's about, making sure that inputs are available. And in the political environment, sometimes it's all driven by power and power seeking. And you just have to understand that dynamic and how you're communicating that. But when you're working on policy, you're communicating to so many audiences, right? You're communicating within, the political environment where you're trying to get that legislation moving. But the people that are your real stakeholders are your citizenry. And you need to make them aware of why you're doing what you're doing and what benefit is to them and how it's going to improve their lives, and why this fight is worth it. So that was the benefit for me. I always kind of saw it through that lens, and we got that legislation passed, and it was a good day. I felt really good that day going to work. And so it wasn't every day, but that was a good day.
Yeah, that's amazing. I imagine those huge wins keep you going and energize you through some of those harder times. And yeah, that's really beautiful. I'm curious for communications at large, right? How you see the evolution of media and it impacting communications. Speaking of political comms, we saw podcasts come more to the forefront in the last presidential election, right? As one example. How do you see this evolution in media playing out, and what do you think communicators need to be aware of in terms of that?
Uh-huh. So, we have traditional communications, which we think of in terms of the traditional broadcast networks, cable, even cable's now considered somewhat traditional, the major newspapers. And then, to your point, you've seen the evolution of what began as blogs and then podcasts. And then, I think it's such a disparate media landscape that the
Mm,
challenge for communicators is when you have a important message to share, or you're in a high stakes situation, um, you have to figure out the ways that you're going to get that information out to the most people in the shortest amount of time. And that's where your digital platform becomes so critically important. Right. And making sure that you understand your segmentation, your audience segmentation, who's receiving their information where. So in any organization I've worked in, you know, certain people may be looking at Facebook for something. Even today, there are groups that are looking to Facebook only for their information. There's LinkedIn, entirely different audience, Twitter, a different audience. So you have to, as communications team, know that audience segmentation so well so that the messaging you're delivering through those platforms is resonating and hitting them as you need them to learn that information as you're trying to change people's direction, for example. So I think that advantages of some of these new media platforms, and we see traditional journalists moving into these new platforms, on
yep.
Substack and so forth. So you still have a very high caliber of journalism being done on some of these platforms. But in all the platforms, we've seen this gravitational pull toward, division, let's say it that way.
Yeah,
Right? So
absolutely.
certain platforms catering to an audience maybe on the left, and a certain platform to audiences on the right. And people, and as communicators, you're factoring this in, and depending on what you're communicating about. And so that's part of the landscape too. But what all of this diversity provides is no matter where you're working as a communicator, you now have many more choices on how to deliver your information, how to pitch your stories. And there's so much diversification in what those podcasters are focused on. There's just so many choices. So you have some control, and then you have the ability to take that and push it out over your digital platforms. So there's ways to take that information, which might be a smaller audience that you're initially pushing out to, and then repurpose it more broadly. I always say working at CNN taught me, with all of the networks we had, I would report on one story and it would appear multiple different ways across multiple different platforms. And that was a tremendous learning experience, because I've been able to apply that knowledge and skill set in other environments in which I've worked.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, it seems like you've had these building blocks in your career that have really complemented each other,
Mhm.
and so kind of culminating now in the consulting work you're doing, could you talk a little bit about what that looks like? You mentioned now you're an entrepreneur, and so could you talk about kind of this phase of your career that you're in now?
Sure. So I actually ran my own business for a decade before I went into CDC. And in that time, I really focused at the cross section of media, public policy, and business. So represented organizations that might have had issues that were in the public policy arena that might have either negatively or positively impacted their organization or business. And then, of course, it was working with media to convey that story and that importance, and in many cases, too, to mitigate risk to their businesses. And so I'm still continuing that work now. So I've kind of picked up that work and have several clients that I work with similarly, some in the crisis communication space, reputation management, and then again, folks that have that cross section where all three of these industries and verticals kind of commingle, and using communication as a tool to navigate through that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you, Loretta, and you've had such a fascinating career thus far. And I really appreciate you sharing not only some of the best practices and communications tenets, so to speak, for some of this work, but also just what was going through your head and some of the challenges you personally faced as you were navigating some of these major world events. So I really appreciate your perspective, and it's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure here as well. And I wish you the best of luck.
Great. You as well. Thank you.